If it's Wednesday, will Trump's rivals take him on? Should they? Can they? Those are the questions right now facing Republicans on the campaign trail, as the former president faces political and legal peril and the actual potential for prison time. Plus, for the first time in more than a year, the Federal Reserve did not hike interest rates, but its warned inflation is far from over, and markets are still a little uncomfortable. And Secretary of State Blinken is headed to Beijing. Finally, it's a bid to ease tensions, try to repair relations with one of America's most crucial economic rivals, if you will, following months of turmoil over Chinese military tactics and spying campaigns. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Chuck Todd, reporting here in Washington. And for the second time this year, and for the second time ever, we're examining a presidential primary where the frontrunner and last holder of the office was just arraigned. And this time, it was on federal charges. Politically speaking, the sweeping indictment could be the best opening so far for the rest of the Republican presidential field to seriously take on the man who's been the party's standard bearer and leader for the past 7 years. But three questions face the field when it comes to taking on Trump in this post-indictment moment. Will they? Should they? And can they? It all depends on what you think you're trying to accomplish with your own campaign. Those three questions. At the moment, the will of the field to try to exploit this potential opening does not seem particularly strong. The most direct criticism we've heard so far has come from Chris Christie and Asa Hutchinson. Both men say the charges should disqualify Trump from office. Both men are polling, on a good day, around 1%. Mike Pence and Nikki Haley, both former Trump administration officials, with a bit more pull inside the party, have in the past 24 hours been just ever so slightly critical of the former president's conduct, but making sure to couple any critique with a direct attack generally on the justice system. Take a listen.
I can't defend what's alleged. These are serious allegations, and I share the concern of millions of Americans about the way politics has played a hand, whether it be when Hillary Clinton was exonerated in 2016 for essentially engaging in exactly the kind of behavior that President Trump is accused of here. Should I have the great privilege of serving as President of the United States, I've made it clear we're going to clean house at the highest levels at the Department of Justice.
Two things can be true at the same time. One, the DOJ and FBI have lost all credibility with the American people. The second thing can also be true. If this indictment is true, if what it says is actually the case, President Trump was incredibly reckless with our national security.
Now, Haley followed that up by also saying she would be inclined to pardon Trump if she was elected. And the field's most popular non-Trump candidate, Ron DeSantis, well, he's carefully and backhandedly defended the former president while also borrowing from Trump's playbook by attacking the Justice Department. Separate from the question of will the field use this indictment to go after Trump is, should they? Because that question boils down to why these candidates are running. Are they running to lead the Republican Party or to play a role in Donald Trump's Republican Party? As these candidates consider that question, the old guard of the GOP is warning that Donald Trump simply has too much baggage to win another election.
If we nominate anybody not named Donald Trump, we're going to beat Joe Biden.
Okay, but
we got to nominate somebody not named Donald Trump.
Who would that be? Let me follow up.
Any one of these candidates.
I think if you look at the record in 18, 20, and 22, when he's the issue, we lose. And so I would rather have the issue be Biden and his policies. And I think the way that you do that is you get a different nominee, which is why I endorse somebody else.
Finally, there's the question of can they? Can they use this moment to launch a credible challenge against Trump inside the GOP? Because this might be the most thorny question facing this field. Because even if they wanted to and thought they should, they are facing a powerful pro-Trump feedback loop inside the conservative media ecosystem that fuels this Republican base. Just take a look at this chyron from yesterday, following the president's arraignment. If Republicans at the Capitol and on the campaign trail are performing for those viewers on that infotainment network, you're going to end up with politicians looking for ways to excuse Trump's behavior.
There's no allegation that there was harm done to the national security. There's no allegation that he sold it to a foreign power or that it was trafficked to somebody else or that anybody got access to it.
What about those pictures? Was that a good look for the former president to have boxes in a bathroom?
I don't know. Is it a good picture to have boxes in a garage that opens up all the time? A bathroom door locks.
As somebody who's been to Mar-a-Lago, you just can't walk through Mar-a-Lago of your own accord because Secret Service is all over the place. There are 33 bathrooms at Mar-a-Lago. So don't act like it's just in some random bathroom that the guests can go into. That's not true.
Vaughn Hilliard's outside Trump's Golf Club in New Jersey, where he addressed supporters last night. Also with us on Capitol Hill is Ali Vitale, who's been taking the temperature of Republicans there. But Vaughn, let me start with you. In Bedminster, the former president continues to lean into this indictment. While we debate what the rest of the field should do, there's no debate on what he thinks his best legal defense is. He thinks it's a political defense.
Right, and that's why immediately upon returning to New Jersey, he held what was essentially a rally, an opportunity to give remarks. So, you know, a top aide to his yesterday after the event told us that Donald Trump showed last night that an indictment or indictments are not going to stop him from hitting the campaign trail. They're not going to stop him from running for president. And despite the potential of criminal trials in his future, he is going to continue to campaign and run for president. And that was made very clear. And for Donald Trump, and understanding that over the last 8 years, he has had a band of elected officials and leaders around the country who have consistently come to his defense to build a Republican electorate that is just as defiant largely as he is to the Department of Justice's efforts. He understood that over the next 18 months ahead of a general election where he'd win this Republican nomination, he can set the target elsewhere, and that would be on the man that he faces in November of 2024. Listen to him last night on the stage here at Bedminster.
I will appoint a real special prosecutor to go after the most corrupt president in the history of the United States of America, Joe Biden, and the entire Biden crime family. Name a special prosecutor. And all others involved with the destruction of our elections, our borders, and our country itself.
You heard the chants there from many in the crowd. Lock him up, referring to Joe Biden, despite their man up on that stage just being formally arraigned hours earlier. I think it's important to note also, it was last November when Donald Trump announced his candidacy for 2024, Chuck. That was 7 months ago. What's 7 months from now? You're talking about the Iowa caucus. And I think another important note here coming off of this was the fact that I asked that aide whether inside of Bedminster in the campaign they were waiting to hear what other Republican elected leaders were saying. And the quote to me was, "Oh, sure, we do too. We watch what everybody says. This is going to be an intense few months ahead."
And Vaughn Hilliard, they now have a model. They've done this with 2 indictments. 2 more could come before Labor Day. It sounds like they almost see this as a formula.
And it was deja vu, frankly, last night. Instead of flying to Mar-a-Lago to give the remarks, though, it was to Bedminster. I mean, we've been through this before, and they see a model because, you know, when you look back at March 31st, the day that he was indicted out of Manhattan, he had about a 15 percentage point lead over Ron DeSantis. We're now looking at an average of a 30-point lead over Ron DeSantis now. So at least politically, they see the benefits within the Republican electorate. When you get beyond the Republican electorate, of course, we're talking about a different story, but short-term gain for now.
Vaughn Hilliard at Bedminster for us. Vaughn, thank you. Let me move over to Ali Vitale. Ali, you've been taking the temperature. You know, I've got the 3 questions: should they, will they, and can they? A lot of elected Republicans will talk to you if you don't put their name to it. So what are you learning?
Yeah, should they? According to donors and operatives, NBC's reporting that Republicans actually should be taking this moment to go harder and draw more contrast with Trump. Will they? On the record, you're right, not very much so. And I think there's a big divide when you look at what's happening in the House and the Senate. Yet again, it feels like most House Republicans are living on Earth A, defending the former president. Most Senate Republicans are living on Earth B, either not talking about it or being a little bit more tepid in their defense. I mean, look no further than this exchange with Kevin McCarthy versus what Senator Mitch McConnell said about it. Watch.
What's really concerning to the American public, that it really seems like one side of justice is being weaponized and the other is being treated in a different manner.
The Republican campaign for the nomination has already been going on for 6 months. It's going to be going on for a year longer. And I'm just simply not going to comment on the candidates. We've got a bunch of them, and I'm just simply going to stay out of it.
Now, I will say, Chuck, you're right that the tune changes when you don't make these people put their name to it. People are far more critical. They're wringing their hands. They're concerned about what kind of baggage this brings because Trump still, despite the fact that indictments are bad, still has so much political clout over the Republican base.
Allie, should I read anything into the fact I've noticed Kevin McCarthy's very good at this and a few other these Republicans, they're very careful not to say they believe the Justice Department has been weaponized. They always say, people believe that the Justice Department has been weaponized. I find that distinction intriguing. Am I reading too much into it? I mean, is this Kevin McCarthy's way of being able to one day say, I never said they were weaponized. I just said my constituents thought they were weaponized.
Or I wonder if it's a way to inoculate against if a special counsel were to come out with something against Joe Biden for his classified documents, then it allows Republicans to embrace that as legitimate, as opposed to what they're doing right now with Trump, which is, on the Republican House side anyway, not engaging with the substance, the national security implications, what the classified documents, why Trump had opportunities to give them back and didn't. They're not engaging with that. Instead, they're just saying this is an example of a weaponized justice system, two-tier of justice. And what Speaker McCarthy walked away from me yesterday before he was able to answer was he kept bringing up every question. Well, what about Joe Biden? What about Joe Biden? It almost leads to the question of would he prefer and feel better about this whole situation if Biden were for some reason indicted too? He refuses to engage with the realities that these are different scenarios. Biden gave the documents back. Trump, and allegedly on tape, said, well, isn't it better if we just lie and say we don't have them? Like, there are serious differences here that Republicans refuse to engage with. But when you're listening to the parsing of their words, I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if that's why they're parsing them that way.
No, it is just interesting. I will give whatever we want to say. He is very careful in how he words that. And Ali Vitale and Capitol Hill. Ali, thank you. So joining me now on the political fallout of Trump's now second indictment is our panel. Terrific one today. Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for America's newspaper, USA Today. Eugene Robinson, the Washington Post columnist and an NBC News political analyst. And Jim Garrity, a senior political correspondent for the National Review. All right. Should they, will they, can they? Susan, I start with you. What do you expect to happen?
I don't expect much to happen. I mean, I think the most tentative, tiny little fractures, like DeSantis saying when he was in the Navy, he never would have been able to take these classified documents home. So you interpret that as, look at the slap at Trump. If that's a slap at Trump, I'm sorry. It's not much. I do not. I think that Trump has succeeded in getting Republicans to rally around him by being indicted, which is a pretty good trick.
I don't know how you unwind this. Jim, and does more indictments do it?
I say there is not a single Donald Trump supporter out there right now who's going to listen to Ron DeSantis or Vivek Ramaswamy or anybody else coming out and giving a defense of the president, of saying, isn't this unfair? What about Joe Biden, et cetera? And going to look, wow, that's a really good defense. I'm going to vote for Ron DeSantis instead of Donald Trump, right?
Really,
There's no scenario where that happens. So the only way you can do it is say, you know what? Trump is a flawed nominee. If we nominate him, he's going to lose. I am the better choice, and here's why. That's the only way you can beat Trump.
But you're making an electability argument, and that is a question. I don't know whether the party wants to hear electability.
You could also make the argument that being indicted is a bad thing. It's a bad thing to be accused of taking and keeping and hoarding the sensitive national security documents. It's a bad thing to do. He's a bad guy. You can make that argument. Don't you have to say he's a bad guy?
You can say that the long-term consequences could be pretty serious, like you could go to jail. But the short-term consequences have, in this remarkable way, turned to his advantage. It's enabled him to once dominate the conversation, and it's made it very perilous for any Republican to directly criticize him.
If you want to make that argument, we know the Chinese government has been sniffing around Mar-a-Lago, right? If you have, here is where the U.S. military is vulnerable to attack.
Marco Rubio have done this in 2016? that version of Marco Rubio might have.
Yes, I mean, like here's the,
yeah,
and, then he would have repeated it several times after Christie challenged him. But some argument of like, here are the consequences of what Trump did. Here is why it is bad for the country. Here is why it is bad for our military. Here's why it is bad for our national security. Trump screwed up. And here are the consequences for you, America. And this is why this trial is important.
I want to play a clip from the 2016 campaign from the Democratic side, because there was a moment from that campaign that arguably you could say may have cost Bernie Sanders any chance at the nomination. Take a listen.
Let me say something that may not be great politics, but I think the Secretary is right. And that is that the American people are sick and tired of hearing about your damn emails.
Thank you. Me too. Me too.
Enough of the emails. Let's talk about the real issues facing America.
Bunch of ways, Eugene, to interpret that moment. But it was a moment where he decided not to go after what could have been a vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people at that moment thought better of Bernie Sanders for his having done that, right? Because of the way people were, Republicans were piling on Hillary Clinton. I think even a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters thought that was wrong, and therefore...
Well, it goes back to a similar negative partisanship, right? Well, you know, Democrats didn't want to see another Democrat look like a Republican, just like Republicans get mad at fellow Republicans if they use a Democratic critique.
Exactly. Now, in retrospect, that's an interesting hypothesis. In retrospect, it's an interesting hypothesis that if Bernie had gone after Hillary, maybe he would have gotten it.
And the point is this: if you don't do it, aren't you taking away a possibility of a way to change the narrative? Because if you don't do it, like Jim said, defending Trump isn't going to get you a vote.
What world would we be in if Hillary Clinton had not used a private email server when she was Secretary of State? Because it was a huge issue for her in that campaign, and it has given Republicans this out to say she did it and so did he. Why is he being indicted?
Yeah, and it isn't the same, and we can go through all the specific details why it's not the same, but many people just hear classified material.
Actually, that's the most honest thing Bernie Sanders ever said. This is not going to be good politics. Yes, underline that in red. When you go out and you make that argument of, look, there's this vulnerability of my opponent, but I'm not going to take advantage of that. I'm taking that off the table. I'm only interested in beating my opponent on these issues, not those issues. If you're Ron DeSantis, you really want to beat him on woke. Okay, that's great, but look at where you are right now. You're down 30. That's not going to be enough. You're going to need something else to be a compelling argument.
But let me get to the final question, which I think is the one we dealt with, is it even possible? Can they? Meaning, do the dogs want to eat cat food? I guess the way to describe it.
So, they don't want new Trump. They want Trump, right? They don't like they didn't want new Coke. I mean, so that's certainly the situation right now, and it may not be possible, but things can change. One of these candidates could be watching right now and could listen to Jim and say, "Gee, maybe I should actually attack the guy who's leading us all."
If it's impossible and it doesn't matter, well, then you should say what you think is right, because at least you've got that and you can look yourself in the mirror. But here's the thing: if it doesn't matter, then take the swing. What do you have to lose by taking the swing?
But ironically, Susan, I mean, it looks like these debates, Trump's going to have his own defense team on the debate stage. Christie may go after him, but Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be like, I got this.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. Big field probably helps Trump. Lack of confrontation helps Trump. General election, different story.
Whole different story.
Well, and that's the obvious thing, and it comes back to electability. The best case against Trump is electability, and it seems like that is just... Every Republican tries to make this argument, Jim, and it doesn't look like it's had any impact.
And I think one of the reasons it does is if Joe Biden had a really high approval rating right now, and he looked and the economy's roaring, and everything's going great, and inflation isn't, nobody's worried about grocery prices. If everybody felt great, then maybe like, hey, hey, Republicans, we can't botch this. We really need to be.
But there's this perception that anybody can beat him.
Yeah, and I think it's conceivably that when you have an 80-year-old president who tends to mumble and meander and tell old stories about corn pop and stuff like that, and the economy's not great, you never know what's going to happen between now and 2024. Biden could get beaten by Trump.
This is why I think Trump won it in 2016, because of that same perception. Yes, he's less electable, but they didn't think he was unelectable because they thought, well, anybody can beat Hillary.
Well, that's what they thought. So maybe they think anybody can beat Joe Biden. Now, people have thought that before, and Joe Biden is won.
Yeah.
You know, I think electability is a good political argument against Trump. I think, you know, attempted coup is a really good argument as well. You know, I mean, the entire record of the Trump presidency for a lot of voters. It's too much. I don't want to do that again.
And this gets back to something, soon that I think that the left made a mistake when they tried to deplatform Trump. One thing I think we have learned is that the more front and center Trump is to the electorate, the more he exhausts that electorate. Mm-hmm. It is not a good, and I wonder if this is where I think these Republican campaigns are missing. It's like, no, keep hitting him and bait him, because he will not stay quiet when you attack him.
That's true, although that's also his appeal to his voters,
Sure.
that he is willing to say things no one else will say, that he never stops fighting for himself, but that gives him the perception that he's also fighting for you. I'd also like to say that thinking that an attempted coup is grounds to not want to support somebody, very much the traditionalist you are.
Yes, I am. Call me old-fashioned. I'm sorry.
But don't you think it's worth almost trying to make Trump mad if you're a front runner? Christie, we know why Christie's doing it. He's just trying to repair his own relationship with mainstream America for what he did. I understand what but if you actually want to win this thing, you gotta.
Okay, throughout the 2020 Democratic presidential primary, particularly in those early ones, you'd start to see a good fight going. And then often Cory Booker or one of them would say, this is just what the Republicans want to see. We can't fight amongst ourselves. This is a debate.
Yeah.
It's not a group hug. It's not a kumbaya circle. You're supposed to
are doing the same thing, aren't
they? It's like, you have like, whoa, we can't be sitting around criticizing Donald Trump. You're behind. What do you want to do then?
Well, I will give you this. The founder of National Review, the whole point was to have a debate.
Yes.
Right. So Mr. Buckley would be very, very happy to hear you say that, Jim. Susan, Eugene, Jim, thank you guys. Terrific start. We should note, in reference to that Fox banner we showed you at the top of the show in a statement to NBC News that we just got, the spokesperson for the network said the Chiron was taken down immediately and was addressed. Okay. Coming up, the United States of America versus Donald Trump. We're going to dive into the former president's latest legal defense and why it includes Bill Clinton's sock drawer. That's next. Plus, the Fed goes from taking a hike to taking a break. We'll have the details on the latest move on interest rates, what it means for the economy, and the fight against inflation. You are watching Meet the President. Welcome back. This afternoon, the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, made his first public comments since Special Counsel Jack Smith indicted former President Donald Trump. While taking questions from reporters, Garland declined to directly address details of the investigation. But he did defend the Special Counsel's independence as the Department of Justice faces an onslaught of criticism from Trump and defenders of Trump from congressional Republicans.
So, as you know, I can't talk about particulars of this or any other ongoing criminal matter. As I said when I appointed Mr. Smith, I did so because it underscores the Justice Department's commitment to both independence and accountability. Mr. Smith is a veteran career prosecutor. He has assembled a group of experienced and talented prosecutors and agents who share his commitment to integrity and the rule of law.
Those remarks came after the former president again attacked the special counsel's investigation during remarks at his Bedminster property last night, as he claimed before a group of supporters that he had a, quote, legal right to the classified documents at the center of this case. Source tells NBC News it is likely that claim will form the center of his defense strategy. So let's try to unpack that a little bit. Joining me now are NBC News senior legal correspondent Laura Jarrett and Danny Cevallos, a criminal defense attorney and an NBC legal analyst. Laura, let me start with you and whether we have a better idea of the timeline of some of these pre-trial motions, because it obviously gives us a little bit of a window on the likelihood of whether we can see a trial before the election or after. So let's start with Walt Nada here. The delayed arraignment, how much does that impact the timeline?
It shouldn't that much materially, Chuck. The judge in this case, Judge Eileen Cannon, who's actually the one who's going to be overseeing it, so not the magistrate that he appeared in front of yesterday, but the main trial judge, she could set a status conference anytime to bring the attorneys in. Obviously, Trump has been arraigned, and so there's no reason, I would think, to delay things. However, of course, she doesn't have to, and she could sit on this really as long as she wants, and certainly she could wait for Nader to get arraigned and do everything all at once. We just have to wait and see. As of 2 seconds ago, when I checked the docket, there's no movement.
So what you're saying is the judge here, if the judge wants a speedy trial, the judge can make life such that lawyers have to participate, and if the judge wants to stretch things out, she's got that power too?
I cannot overstate enough how much power she's going to wield when it comes to the timing of this. Obviously, we've talked about Trump's legal team delaying things and that being part of the strategy, but she has a role to play in that. Every motion that they file, she can sit on as long as she wants, or she can rule as quickly as she wants. We just don't yet know how she's going to approach these issues. And obviously, people have raised questions based on her past rulings, but she might do things differently this time, especially given the fact that she was so thoroughly rebuked by the federal appeals court last time.
And Laura, walk me through the different. How did these court moments, you know, sort of the pretrial stuff?
Yeah.
You've got Manhattan. You've got this. We're going to have Fulton County likely, and we might have another one here. How is that all coordinated? And is there going to be one trial at a time, or could there be motions in the works for multiple potential trials at the same time?
I think you're going to see a lot of overlapping motion practice and a lot of paper flying and a lot of arguments all happening at the same time. We know we have at least one trial date for sure, and Judge Merchan in Manhattan has already told the former president, I expect you to participate, and I understand that there's a campaign happening, but he made it very clear that trial date is firm, at least the last time we were in front of Judge Merchan in New York. He made that clear. As for Georgia, what's getting interesting there is we know, based on reporting from our Blaine Alexander, that officials for the Fulton County Sheriff's Office have actually been scoping things out, getting ready for any possible indictment. And we just got a statement in from the Fulton County's DA's office who's saying essentially whatever's going on with the feds, that's their business. It will not impact our investigation, which again just shows you there's the federal system and the state system. Everyone's getting sort of a civil procedure lesson in how this country works. Those two can stand alone, and they could be overlapping.
Danny Cevallos, let's talk about the potential Trump defense here. Every right to those documents, right? This is, if he's saying it publicly, we know in many ways his legal theories he throws out there as campaign fodder anyway. Does he have a case?
Do not take Trump's defense case from Trump's mouth. I suspect his actual defense will be different than what we hear him say at rallies. But if his defense involves the Presidential Records Act, and it might, I wouldn't be surprised, because as a defendant, as a defense attorney, you have to try everything because you never know what will work, and your percentages are so low anyway when it comes to a motion to dismiss that you try it. If you think it has an outside chance, you preserve the issue for appeal. Maybe you get a second chance if you're convicted at the Circuit Court of Appeal. But look, you've got to get creative. And in a case like this, with the allegations being as detailed as they are, this defense team has to get creative. So the Presidential Records Act, it may be true that Trump was allowed to designate some records as personal and some as presidential, but that's outside of the realm of classified documents, of national defense information. The case he talked about last night, the Clinton sock drawer case, that involved a very narrow issue of personal and presidential documents. It really didn't involve classified documents, and it certainly didn't involve receiving a subpoena from DOJ and allegedly concealing or moving around boxes of documents.
If you were running this defense team, Danny, and you had 4 trials staring you in the face, would your goal for all of them be delay, or do you start to pick and choose? All right, that one's going to go to trial, so let's start focusing here. This one we have the best chance at doing delays. Let's do that there. I mean, how would you be going about this?
You have to balkanize them. Take each case and treat it as its separate fiefdom. Deal with it. Even have different attorneys on that case, ideally. And I think to some degree Trump has had that, but he also has a high attrition rate for attorneys. And in terms of organizing them all, you really just take them as they come. They're really each court is under no obligation to show deference to the other one. There are some deference rules once somebody is sentenced and a prisoner between the state and federal system, but that's way, way away, and that's not even, we don't know if that's a sure thing or not. At this stage, the courts schedule things at their leisure, and then the litigants have to figure out their own calendars. It's something that lawyers do every day with cases that don't involve the same defendant. They have to manage their calendars based on what the court designates as the trial date, the motions date, and whatever other dates.
Not a single defense attorney we've talked to so far says that they would be advising Walt Nauta to be doing it the way he's doing it. But if he does decide to have his own defense, would his trial happen would the timeline start to diverge?
No, I think you're asking if he had his own counsel. No, the timeline remains the same. These defendants will likely be tried together unless something happens. Unless something happens to sever them. And I'm not aware of that move right now. The far greater probability, in my opinion, is that Walt Nauta, who apparently is not interested in pleading guilty and cooperating with prosecutors today, that question may have a different answer in 2 weeks, in 2 months, or even 6 months down the road.
And Lord Jarrett, given that the former president, owns property in Miami-Dade County, started to, do rallies down there, had the stop at Versailles, how does justice handle the potential tainting of the jury pool?
I think they have to confront it head on, and it was one of the reasons why you can imagine they want to get in front of Judge Cannon pretty quickly to talk about those type of issues, talk about what a protective order would look like so that he can't put certain evidence out there to try to taint the jury pool. Now, you might say, well, they sort of ran a gamble by charging the case down there to begin with. They know what the demographics in Florida are like just as much as they do Washington, D.C., but it also appears that they were more worried about the case getting dismissed if they hadn't brought it in Florida, Chuck.
Yeah, that's for sure. Lord Jarrett, Danny Cevallos, I have more questions, but I don't have more time. Thank you both. Terrific stuff. Up next, we are live at the Federal Reserve, where we heard from Chairman Jerome Powell today. He just finished speaking to reporters in the last hour, following today's interest rate decision. That, of course, has the market rattled. If they had raised interest rates, the market would have gone up, right? So because they didn't, market went down. Details are next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. As we mentioned, the Fed did something unusual today, though they had been telegraphing it for weeks. It didn't hike interest rates this quarter, for this month at least. For the first time since March of last year, the central bank kept rates steady, and it didn't raise them, as new data points to ease inflation and price pressure have been coming out. But the Fed chair, Jay Powell, also signaled today that the Fed's fight against inflation is not yet over. We're not at 2%, we're still at 4%. And the policymakers will likely raise rates twice before the end of this year. The markets did not like hearing that news, which is why the Dow closed down more than 230 points today due to future interest rate hikes. It comes as many consumers are still feeling some pain of higher prices. Shoppers in Chicago told NBC the cost of food remains above what they're used to.
Everything around is going up. I ain't gonna say gas is a little level out now. But the food, some of the food is ridiculous.
I believe it when I see it.
You don't feel it yet?
No, I don't see it either.
Well, let's bring in CNBC senior economics reporter Steve Leisman. He's at the Fed. And Steve, I just did my own road trip over the last long weekend for myself. And yeah, the price of gas is now back to sort of normal figures everywhere. But it really does seem as if it's the price of housing that seems to be the issue here more than anything, because that has not budged.
Yeah, housing hasn't budged because over 15 years, Chuck, we have not built enough houses in this country. And, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for the people you just quoted there, because what has happened to the average American is prices have gone up and their wages haven't gone up along with prices. And I don't think what the Fed is trying to do is to engineer prices to fall back to where they were. That's not part of the plan. They just want to keep the rate of increase from going up. That's what we call inflation. And they're trying to bring it back down to a more normal 2% a year. And then people's standard of living will maintain if they get raises above that.
Is this a good economy, statistically or not, Steve?
Statistically, it's an economy that's running below potential, but it's not an economy in recession. It's an economy with a very good job market, an historically good job market, but with an economy with an inflation problem that has remained kind of stubborn. It's not the worst inflation problem. We've seen, places where it's been double digit, where it's been hyperinflation. It's about double where it should be, but it's coming down. So it could be a good economy. If you can get inflation back down towards 2%, people can hold on to the raises they have, then the standard of living should go up or at least maintain where it's been.
I saw what the market did today, but is the market now betting against a recession?
It's a great question, Chuck. What has happened over the past several months is the idea of a soft landing for the economy, that is, we vanquish inflation without a deep recession, has gotten a little more respect on Wall Street. It used to be, if you talked about soft landing, they'd kind of laugh you off. I've kind of been in that camp for a while where I thought it was possible for, say, Jay Powell and the Fed to what we might call stick the landing and have a soft landing. So it is possible that that can happen. The unemployment rate projection from the Fed today, pretty mild, 4.1%. We had been as low as 3.4, but if we get out of this, Chuck, with just a 4.1% unemployment rate, I think that would be a pretty big win.
We still have a labor shortage, right? And it's still on the service sector, correct?
Yeah, there's still, I look today at leisure and hospitality, for example, that sector of the economy is still running 500,000 jobs below where it was before the pandemic. And guess what? The sector and the economy have grown. So actually, the shortage is less. Medical care, health care, education, all those places are places that, even in government, by the way, are places that don't have the same numbers of workers or need more workers. So there's still a labor shortage. It's still a good time to be a worker here. Probably what's happened, Chuck, and the issue that's going on is some of the sectors during the pandemic, they hired more than they ended up needing for when the pandemic ended. So we have to have a lot of churn going on in the job market to get the workers in the right place.
Yeah, it does feel like this is still, history will probably still call this pandemic recovery mode, but we'll see. Yeah. I think we all look forward to looking at this historically rather than living it. Steve Leisman at the Fed for us. Steve, great to hear from you. After the break, Blinken to Beijing, America's top diplomat, finally headed back to China amid rising tensions between the two superpowers and some new revelations about Chinese spy operations in our hemisphere. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. Secretary of State Antony Blinken will finally be making a much-discussed high-stakes visit to Beijing. Remember, he postponed the trip back in February after that Chinese spy balloon was spotted flying across the United States. State Department officials say the goal of this two-day trip is to establish communication channels, which have been frayed in recent weeks, including after China rejected a meeting with the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, as well as discussions about regional and global security issues. All of this comes amid deepening tensions between the U.S. and China, including provocative military encounters in the air and at sea in Asia, and new confirmation from the White House that China and Cuba have reached an agreement to put an electronic eavesdropping facility in Cuba, and that China has been spying on the United States from a base from Cuba for years. So joining me now is Michael Allen. He's a former senior director at the National Security Council in the Bush administration. He's also a former majority staff director for the House Intelligence Committee. Michael, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
So
good to see you.
This Cuba-China connection, I know you've know this particular part of this really well. I want to start with the Cuba policy. If Trump doesn't get rid of the Cuba policy that Obama established during his years, where a bit of a rapprochement to Cuba, does China establish this base in Cuba?
I still think they do. I think the Chinese wanted to be able to populate the Western Hemisphere, if you will, with intelligence platforms. That's, of course, something we've done all over Asia. So I saw it as spy versus spy, part of the normal product of a bilateral relationship. And so I think they would have gone forward regardless.
There's a part of me that wonders what can they actually do from Cuba in the eavesdropping space that's effective? I mean, it's not like we're not aware of that, and it's not like Cuba's not been an intelligence concern to our hemisphere for decades.
Well, I think it's the same reason why when you go to embassies around the globe and even here in Washington, you see antenna and satellite dishes all over the place. And that's because there are cellular communications here in the atmosphere, if you will, that are suitable for collection. And not only that, I think many of our military bases put off a signature, if you will, something about heat sources or the electronics that are being emitted that they can use and analyze to deduce what we're doing on a variety of different military bases around the globe. So I think it's helpful in the end, not only for the United States and our platforms around the world, but certainly China wants the same thing.
I'm curious, would it be worth trying to get China off of Cuba? Or is this sort of, you accept this is, as you put it, spy versus spy. We've got our own agenda that we're trying to stand up for a rules-based order in Asia. And at the end of the day, it is not worth us changing our Cuba policy over this.
I think if I'm the Biden administration, I probably have some strong words for the Cubans and try and warn them away from it. But I don't know that I would put it as one of the greatest efforts that they should undertake here as they try to move forward with their Cuba policy. And that's because it is spy versus spy. This is something that we would do and that we have done on allied territory all over the globe. We don't love it that the Chinese are in our backyard, but I think it is something that becomes now part of a rigorous counterintelligence program by the United States to make sure we're taking defensive measures against the Chinese.
Well, what kind of worries do we have in the rest of South America and Central America? I mean, I know that we know that some of those countries have been flirting with the Chinese.
Yeah, very much so. One, I think, is the Chinese that want to set up bases, military bases on the Atlantic Ocean, not only in Africa, but I think they're also looking for a port in the Western Hemisphere.
In the Caribbean?
They've obviously got relations with Venezuela as well. So there's a variety of different countries, if you will, Chuck, that are sort of trending in the direction of the Chinese. The Chinese have a very aggressive aid and assistance packages that they give to a variety of countries. And I think that's one of the inducements the Chinese want to offer so that over time they may want to have a military base there. You remember they tried to do this in the UAE and we went in heavy to the UAE and said, no way, no how can you do this? Expect us to do the same thing on a military base, but it's a little bit different, I think, for an intelligence platform.
All right, let's go to the Blinken trip. What's a realistic deliverable, to speak the language you used to speak in the NSC world?
Yeah, I think they're going to come out of this just happy that we're talking again and that Xi Jinping will be on track to come to San Francisco for the APEC summit. I think the administration began this year hoping to have more normal relations with the Chinese. You remember they use this term guardrails all the time. They don't want the relationship to go off into the ditch. And so I think they were worried after the balloon, which kind of interfered with relations between us and the Chinese for many months. Yeah. I think they just want to make sure that the relationship is not in a free fall. The question, though, is will the Chinese try to improve relations with us? You just showed the footage of what they're doing very dangerously in the South China Sea and in the air over the South China Sea. So there's a lot to be tense about.
Well, it's interesting to me, then maybe it's in that context I want to ask you about a comment Janet Yellen made yesterday. She went out of her way to say we're not trying to decouple from China. I assume that was for an audience in Beijing as much as it was for an audience anywhere else. But don't tell Congress that. They've been passing laws to do just that, which is decouple. What is our policy, economic policy, in terms of China?
Well, look, I mean, the administration says it's to de-risk, not to decouple. I think they did that to get on the same page as the Europeans, which, by the way, I think was wise because over time we need to be more aligned with the Europeans as we deal with China. But you're onto something else, and that is I don't think a lot of people in town can adequately describe just what is the China policy. Sometimes Secretary Blinken says it's invest, align, and compete, but other times it looks confrontational. And honestly, for the last few weeks, it looks like a pro-engagement strategy. And all the while, I think Senator Kerry, Secretary Kerry, is over there trying to cut deals on climate change. Right. So it's a little bit confusing to confront someone while at the same time trying to cooperate with them.
Well, And if you talk about China in a domestic political area, just bashing them is good politics, which, of course, I think complicates perhaps what the policymakers want to engage in as well. Michael Allen, good to have your expertise on the show. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you.
Still to come, conflict and catastrophe. A record number of people have had to flee their homes due to violence, persecution, and natural disaster. That's according to a brand new United Nations report. Well, the leader of one of the world's top humanitarian rescue groups joins me next to discuss. You're watching Meet the President. Welcome back. A staggering new report out of the United Nations today, as experts now estimate that the people that have been forcibly displaced by conflict, persecution, or human rights violations grew to over 108 million in the last year. That number grew by 19 million in 2022 alone, driven in large part by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The war has forced over 11 million people to flee from their own homes, and with nearly 6 million leaving the country altogether. About 35% of currently displaced people are classified as refugees or asylum seekers. And as you can see in this chart, that number grew sharply last year as well. War will do that. To put the overall numbers into some perspective, this means 1 in every 74 people on this planet has had to leave their home. If we view that through an American lens, it's roughly the equivalent of a third of the total U.S. population. You're trying to get your arms around this. I'm joined now by David Miliband. He's the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee. He is on the front lines of this. And David, let's start with, we know we have the reasons behind this. How about the resources to deal with it? Are the rich countries doing enough?
Thanks, Chuck. Humanitarian aid is a growth industry for all the wrong reasons.
Right.
And we can see that this is now a trend, not a blip. Your graphs show that very clearly. In direct answer to your question, it's very striking that it's poor countries and lower middle income countries who bear the brunt of the burden. About 70% of the world's refugees are in poor or lower middle income countries rather than rich countries. In terms of the way the rich countries are stepping up, there's two sides to this story. The Ukraine side of the story is actually a very encouraging side. Europe has stood up in a very striking way, guaranteeing residence, work permits, education for kids for 5, 6, 7 million Ukrainian refugees. But for the rest of the refugee population, it's a much more tough story of really struggling to survive. Poverty rates very high, violence against women very high. And so the truth is that the international aid system is struggling to catch up with the scale of the problem. And our call is to say, look, you've got to manage this problem, because if you don't, it just gets bigger and bigger.
We didn't even bring up the climate displacement. So take Pakistan, because this is one of the countries I think you're referring to. They've been having to take in refugees from Afghanistan in particular, and at the same time, they've had some natural disasters that is arguably so bad they cannot handle it on their own. If you throw in climate displacement, what do these numbers look like?
Well, that's a great point, because there's a footnote in the report which says, by the way, in this figure of 108 million, we've not counted the 33 million who we think are climate internally displaced. They've not yet crossed a border, but that's in addition. And so all of the trends, all of the drivers are towards more people being forced to flee their homes. We're not talking about people, I mean, people like me. I moved to America to get a job, but I wasn't forced to do
Correct.
so. We're talking about forced displacement. And so the climate crisis needs to be layered on top of this. And of course, the striking feature of the climate crisis is that most of those countries on the front line have done least to contribute to it and are spending the least to counteract its ill effects. Just to give you one example of that, Somalia, war-torn country, also a country hit hard by drought, climate-related. They're spending, and they're supported to the tune of $1 per person per year to adapt to the climate crisis. That's only brewing up more people movement in the future.
So if you could get the rich countries together, if you could be at the G7, if you could be at the G20, what does refugee aid look like going forward when you're going to have so many? You know, it's not just about taking in people. It's also about probably building resilience, helping to develop things like this. I feel like we're a long way away from something like that.
Well, you're absolutely right to want to get to the roots of the problem. There is an IRC 3-point plan, 5-point plan, 10-point plan on this. But just to give you the key highlights, one, we've got to bring back diplomacy. 54 civil conflicts going on around the world at the moment. They're the primary driver of refugee and internal displacement flows.
54. Wait. Let's not fly over that. 54. Ukraine's just one of them. Okay.
Ukraine's actually the fifth. These are 54 civil conflicts within countries. So we're talking Syria, we're talking Somalia, we're talking internal conflicts, civil wars. Ukraine, war between states on top of that. So we've got to bring diplomacy back. Secondly, we've got to deal the fragile states into the climate bargain. At the moment, they're being ignored even by those who are trying to make a difference on the climate front. We can't just spend trillions on decarbonizing the energy supply of countries like this. We've also got to help countries on the front line adapt to the climate crisis. Thirdly, we've got to fund the refugee crisis other than Ukraine in the same way that the Ukraine crisis is being supported. If refugees around the world had the kind of support that refugees from Ukraine have in Europe, we'd be seeing very different figures on the number of people in poverty, the amount of humanitarian distress around the world.
David Miliband, you always give a lot of good voice to this. It's important to get your perspective, all the work you've been doing over the years on refugee
Thanks so much for having me on. I really
appreciate you doing it.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you all for being with us this hour. I appreciate that. We'll be back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues right now with my friend Hallie.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.